What if I told you that one of the greatest comebacks in business history started with humiliation? What if the moment that looked like the end was actually the beginning? In 1985, a 30-year-old visionary was forced out of the very company he built. Not by competitors, not by failure in the market, but by his own board. The co-founder of Apple Incorporated was fired. His name? Steve Jobs. This wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a public rejection. A loss of identity. A collapse of control. Imagine building something from a garage, watching it grow into a global brand, and then being told you no longer belong in the room. For many, that would have been the end. But for Steve Jobs, it became the turning point. Because sometimes, the greatest transformation happens after the greatest humiliation. In today's episode of Billionaire Backstories, we're diving into the day Steve Jobs lost everything, and how that loss built the foundation for one of the most powerful comebacks in history. This is not just a story about business. It's a story about identity, failure, reinvention, and why the worst day of your career might secretly be your greatest advantage. Let's begin. In 1985, something happened that shocked Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, the visionary co-founder of Apple Incorporated, was fired. Not by a competitor. Not by a rival. By his own company. The company he started in a garage. The company he built with relentless belief. The company that carried his fingerprints in every product. Imagine building something from nothing. Pouring your youth into it. Defending it. Shaping its identity. And then being told you no longer belong. This wasn't just a job loss. It was personal. Jobs was young. Ambitious. Brilliant. But also intense. Demanding. Uncompromising. Apple was growing fast. But internally, tension was growing faster. Board members were nervous. Executives were divided. Power struggles were forming. Success had arrived, but stability had not. And in the middle of it all stood Jobs. Confident. Defiant. Certain he was right. But sometimes, being right is not enough. Leadership is not just vision. It is alignment. And alignment was collapsing. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic corporate decisions in modern history. The founder would be forced out. And the world was about to learn a painful lesson. Sometimes the day you lose everything is the day your real story begins. Before the firing, there was momentum. Apple wasn't just another startup. It was revolutionary. The Apple II had exploded in popularity. Personal computing was no longer a dream, it was happening. Steve Jobs had charisma. He could sell vision like poetry. He convinced investors. He persuaded engineers. He inspired belief. Then came the Macintosh. Jobs saw it not just as a computer, but as a statement. A machine for thinkers. For creators. For rebels. The 1984 Super Bowl commercial shocked the world. It positioned Apple as the underdog fighting conformity. And Jobs stood at the center of that narrative. But behind the curtain, reality was different. The Macintosh was innovative, but expensive. Sales didn't meet expectations. Tension between Jobs and then CEO John Sculley intensified. Jobs was passionate. Sculley was corporate. Vision versus stability. Innovation versus control. And as pressure mounted, alliances shifted. The board began to question leadership direction. Jobs believed he was protecting the company's soul. Others believed he was destabilizing it. Success had come quickly. But maturity hadn't caught up. And when growth outpaces structure, conflict becomes inevitable. The rise was impressive. But the fall was forming. The relationship between Steve Jobs and John Sculley deteriorated rapidly. Jobs had recruited Sculley from Pepsi with a famous challenge. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world? But now, that partnership was fracturing. Jobs tried to rally the board to remove Sculley. Sculley learned of the plan. And moved first. The board had to choose. The passionate founder. Or the steady executive. Emotion versus predictability. And corporations often choose predictability. In a closed-door meeting, Jobs lost. The board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was stripped of power. He remained chairman in title. But without operational control. He had been sidelined. In the company he built. Imagine that moment. The silence. The realization. The humiliation. He later described it as devastating. Publicly embarrassed. Privately crushed. This wasn't just a business defeat. It was identity collapse. Because Apple wasn't just his company. It was him. And now, it was moving forward without him. Sometimes rejection doesn't come from strangers. It comes from what you built. And that hurts differently. News spread quickly. The young visionary behind Apple Incorporated was out. In Silicon Valley, perception matters. And perception was brutal. He wasn't seen as a misunderstood genius. He was labeled difficult. Immature. Unmanageable. Investors questioned his leadership style. Executives whispered about his temperament. The narrative shifted. From prodigy to problem. For someone who built identity around innovation and control, this was crushing. Jobs later admitted he felt exposed. Stripped. Embarrassed in front of the entire industry. The company he loved was moving forward without him. And worse, it appeared stable without him. That silence was louder than criticism. When the organization you built continues, you begin to question your own necessity. Was he replaceable? Was his role overstated? Was his vision too extreme? Failure becomes louder when it is public. When the world watches you fall. When your name is attached to the loss. But public failure carries something private victories never do. Perspective. And perspective was beginning to form. Because for the first time in years, Steve Jobs had no power. No control. No title that mattered. Just space. And sometimes space is the birthplace of reinvention. Losing a job is painful. But losing identity? That is deeper. Steve Jobs didn't just lose a position. He lost the platform that defined him. Apple was his life's work. His validation. His proof. Without it, who was he? For months, he wandered emotionally. He considered leaving Silicon Valley. Considered stepping away from technology entirely. Imagine that. The man who would later redefine multiple industries. Almost walked away. He described feeling like he had failed publicly and permanently. At 30 years old, he believed the best chapter of his life might already be over. This is the dangerous moment after failure. The space where self-doubt grows. Where pride feels wounded. Where quitting feels easier than rebuilding. But something important happened during this collapse. He began to see clearly. The pressure of running Apple had blinded him. Now, the noise was gone. And clarity replaced chaos. He still loved building. He still loved technology. He still loved creating. The firing did not remove his passion. It only removed his position. And that difference changed everything. Because when passion survives failure, reinvention becomes possible. Instead of retreating, Jobs chose to build again. He founded a new company, Next. This time, he moved differently. Still intense. Still demanding. But wiser. Next wasn't built for mass consumers. It focused on advanced computing for universities and research institutions. It was sleek. Innovative. Beautifully designed. But commercially? It struggled. Sales were limited. Production costs were high. The market wasn't ready. On paper, Next was not a massive success. But strategically? It was transformational. Because during this period, Jobs refined his leadership. He matured. He learned patience. He learned how to balance vision with structure. Failure had reshaped him. And Next's technology would later become the foundation for something much bigger. Sometimes your next move isn't about immediate victory. It's about preparation. And while Apple moved on without him, the story was not finished. It was just evolving. While building Next, Jobs made a decision that many thought was reckless. He purchased a small graphics division from Lucasfilm. It wasn't a tech company. It wasn't a hardware startup. It was an animation studio. He renamed it Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled. The technology was powerful, but no one knew how to monetize it. Jobs invested millions of his own money to keep it alive. For years, it bled cash. Friends advised him to shut it down. Critics said he was distracted. But Jobs saw something others didn't. Storytelling powered by technology. Art driven by computation. Eventually, Pixar shifted focus to animated films. Then in 1995, everything changed. Toy Story was released. It became the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a global success. Pixar exploded in value. Jobs, once labeled a failed executive, suddenly became a billionaire. But more importantly, he had proven something. His creativity had not left him. His instinct had not failed him. He had simply need. While Jobs was evolving, Apple was declining. After his departure, product lines became confusing. Innovation slowed. Identity blurred. The company that once challenged the status quo began to look ordinary. Revenue dropped. Leadership changed repeatedly. The spark was fading. Ironically, the very thing the board had removed, Jobs' intensity, was what the company now lacked. Meanwhile, Next had built something remarkable. Its operating system was powerful, elegant, advanced. And Apple needed exactly that. In 1996, Apple made a bold move. They acquired Next. And with that acquisition, Steve Jobs returned. Not as the reckless young founder, but as a sharpened strategist. More disciplined. More focused. More experienced. This time, he understood structure. He understood patience. Failure had trained him. And Apple was desperate for vision. The circle was closing. The founder who had been removed was walking back in. But he was not the same man who left. He was stronger. When Jobs returned, Apple was weeks away from collapse. Cash reserves were low. Products were scattered. Morale was fractured. His first move? Simplify. He cut dozens of product lines. Focused on clarity. Restored design as priority. Rebuilt culture. He wasn't trying to save everything. He was protecting what mattered. Then came the iMac. Bold colors. Clean design. Consumer-friendly. It was different. And different worked. Momentum returned. Confidence followed. Then came the iPod. Then the iPhone. Then the iPad. Apple didn't just recover. It dominated. The same man who had once been declared unfit to lead redefined entire industries. Technology. Music. Mobile communication. And it all traces back to one painful moment in 1985. The day he was fired. The rejection that refined him. The humiliation that matured him. The setback that prepared him. Because sometimes the worst day of your career is the foundation of your greatest comeback. In 2005, standing before graduates at Stanford University, Steve Jobs said something unforgettable. Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Think about that. The humiliation. The rejection. The public failure. He called it a gift. Because being fired removed the weight of success. It freed him to become a beginner again. It forced him to build without ego. It refined his leadership. It deepened his patience. It expanded his vision beyond one company. Without being fired, there would be no Pixar dominance. Without being fired, Next would not exist. Without Next, Apple would not have the operating system that powers its modern era. Without that setback, there is no comeback story. The world celebrates the iPhone. But few celebrate the boardroom loss that made it possible. This is the truth about greatness. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is preparation for it. Sometimes you lose the position to discover your purpose. Sometimes doors close to push you toward mastery. Sometimes rejection is redirection. The day Steve Jobs was fired was not the end of his story. It was the purification of it. And maybe, just maybe, the setback you are facing right now is not a verdict. It is training. Lesson 1: Failure is not final. Sometimes what feels like collapse is simply correction. Being removed from Apple forced Steve Jobs to confront himself, to mature, to refine his leadership, to rebuild without ego. Which leads to the second lesson. Lesson 2: Identity must be bigger than position. When he lost the company, he did not lose his passion. He still loved building. He still loved innovation. Your title can be taken. Your purpose cannot. Then came Next. Then Pixar. Then the return. And here is lesson 3. Rejection can be redirection. Without being fired, there is no Pixar revolution. No Next operating system. No legendary comeback. The pain prepared him. The setback trained him. The distance sharpened him. And when he returned to Apple, he returned wiser. More disciplined. More strategic. More powerful. Final lesson. Growth often hides inside discomfort. The day you lose something may be the day you gain clarity. The day doors close may be the day vision opens. So if you are facing a setback right now, don't rush to label it failure. It might be preparation. This has been Billionaire Backstories, where we don't just tell success stories. We uncover the struggles that built them. If this story moved you, share it. Because someone out there needs to hear that losing everything might be the beginning of becoming unstoppable. Until the next story.